passage.
Recording in progress.
Our second week of our stewardship series, where we're looking at money and resources. Stewardship, not just about money, but also about practices, ways that we use and allocate resources in our personal lives, but also in our collective lives. How do we act as stewards of what God has given us, whether that is our personal finances, whether that is the natural resources of the earth? How do we make sure that everybody has enough? And so we'll be looking at Leviticus and also Deuteronomy. And so Deuteronomy 19, and then jumping down to chapter 25 to begin. So it starts by saying these words: "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or glean or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien, for I am the Lord your God." Jumping down to Leviticus 25. "You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth, or harvest the unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces." Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. "Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of your community owes you. There will be no one in need among you, because the Lord is sure to bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to occupy, if only you will obey the Lord by diligently observing this entire commandment. When the Lord your God has blessed you, you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of the towns within the land that the Lord gives you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You shall rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a thought thinking, 'The 7th year, the year of remission, is near,' and therefore view your needy neighbor with hostility. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and be unjudging when you do so. For on this account the Lord will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and the needy neighbor in your land." This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. And so I have entitled this sermon, "Dreaming of Jubilee, Breaking the Chains." I think I mentioned to you that the Stewardship Series actually comes originally from Sanctified Art, and so I haven't exactly done it the way that they suggest, but the second week that we're looking at today is reimagine when it comes to our money, when it comes to how we use resources. Dreaming of Jubilee. Dreaming is more powerful than we often give it credit for. According to Matthew Walker in his book, Why We Sleep, dreaming does more than just entertain us while we're sleeping. It actually can enhance our creativity. Over time, it can sharpen problem-solving skills. It can even help us resolve emotional traumas that we may or may not be aware of. Those things that are below the surface can actually be healed by dreaming. In essence, dreaming helps us heal, it helps us grow, it helps us envision new possibilities. And Tricia Hersey, in her book, Rest is Resistance, also pushes that a little bit further and reminds us that our society's addiction to overwork and productivity has stolen, essentially, our ability to dream. It is her who says we are conditioned to accept exhaustion as a badge of honor. But Hersey says exhaustion will not save us. It is dreaming that will save us. Dreaming is not just an escape. It can be a revolutionary act that can lead us to a future that is not limited by the systems that we have inherited. Dreaming is a portal to our imagination. A personal practice that I've adopted in my own life is actually recording my dreams. And so I try and write down what I remember immediately after waking. Some of it is the weirdest, most random things, but being able to read these things over time helps me put together patterns, helps me figure out, oh, I actually do have an idea for that problem or that relationship or whatever. And so often I find these new insights and ideas that are woven into the images that I get at night. Dreams, whether in sleep or in waking, are powerful because they help us envision a new reality that is different than the one that we see. Well, I'm here to tell you today that God has a dream also, and it is called Jubilee. Jubilee is God's dream for a world that is set free from debt, oppression, inequality, and stewardship, which is part of our series for this month. At its core is the practice of dreaming with God. It is the practice of thinking creatively about how we use our time, how we use our talents, how we use our money, how we use our resources to bring about a better world. When we dream with God, we step into the creative, liberating power that can transform not just us, but everything around us. So let's dive more into this dream that God had for the people of Israel. The year of Jubilee, as described in Leviticus 25, was this time of profound liberation, restoration. There were all these different Sabbath practices that builded on one another. It started with, you rest on the seventh day. You don't do any work. You let your body restore itself. And then that escalated to, you let the land rest. You don't do things to the earth. You let the land rest. And then that escalated to, you forgive debts that have been accumulated. You have slaves be released. You have land be returned to its original owners. And this was a practice of resetting the economic and social order occurring every 50 years, reflecting God's dream for a just and equitable society. And so the year of Jubilee, which started off as something really small, like a day that you have just to rest and not work, and the year of Jubilee became Sabbath on steroids. Like, what would it look like for the entire society to have such a practice that isn't just individual, but then begins to multiply for all of the things that have been accumulated over time? And so in ancient Israel, the accumulation of debt was not unlike our own. It had devastating consequences. Families could lose their land because of debt, their primary means of survival. Those unable to pay their debts would be forced into slavery in order to make up for the debt. And the year of Jubilee provided a reset button for everything, forgiving those debts, releasing slaves from bondage. This was to ensure that these disparities, any type of disparity at all, never became permanent. It prevented the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few, while many would be left without. The laws surrounding Jubilee, God's dream, was to break the cycles of poverty and ensure that those types of things didn't continue to affect generations and generations. And so every 50 years, you would have a clean slate. The Jubilee laws were not just about individual acts of charity, they were about redistribution, a total reset. The aim was not only to care for the poor, but then to also reset the conditions that created the poverty in the first place. It encouraged a culture of mutual care and interdependence, where people were reminded of their responsibility to one another and their shared relationship to God. God's dream was for an economy where the vulnerable were always going to be protected, where resources were always going to be shared equitably, that any type of inequities that existed would be reset eventually. And so this radical dream of Jubilee reflected the belief that all of creation belonged to God, that God had given it in abundance, as we talked about last week, for the well-being of everyone. This practice kept people from hoarding things so that resources would be shared. And so the word Jubilee comes from a Hebrew word that talks about celebration and joy. When Jubilee came, there was a trumpet that sounded to announce the Jubilee year. The trumpet heralded a time of joy for those who had lost out in the marketplace or struggled through years of hardship, for those farmers who had suffered droughts or misfortune. The sound of the trumpet would be an announcement of salvation, a promise that they would be restored and set free from the chains that they were under. At its core, the dream of Jubilee was a mandate to prevent exploitation, to ensure that no one would actually be left behind, that no one individual or no one family would be left behind. The dream of Jubilee would be a reminder that because God had liberated them from Egypt and slavery, they were not to continue those practices. They were not to sell each other back into slavery, either literally or through oppressive practices. Now, interestingly, I call it God's dream because we do not have any evidence of the people actually doing this, at least on a wide scale. Right? We do not have any stories of people actually doing this to the level at which God dreamed for the people to do it. Unfortunately, we don't really know why. There were stories told of people incorporating parts of it or doing it in little small doses, but it never quite ended up being lasting. And still, this practice was recorded for us to read and to study and to think about. It remained a part of the collective psyche and memory, and bits and pieces of it even carried over into the New Testament. I think about Jesus, who said that his arrival onto the scene was the fulfillment of Jubilee, where prisoners would be released and debts would be forgiven. And Jesus said that through my life, I am bringing Jubilee. Through my ministry, I am bringing Jubilee. In Romans, we hear things like, owe no debt to anyone except love, and things of this nature. But still, God's dream that has never been fully realized was a vivid expression for thriving, a reality where there's mercy for all. And so I still think that Jubilee is worth trying, is worth living into in the ways that we are able to. As we reflect on this ancient call, we're called to ask, what would it look like in today's world? Our current social economic systems, much like those in ancient Israel, are rife with modern forms of debt and enslavement. Debt remains still one of the most pervasive forms of economic control, much like in ancient Israel, where debt could lead you to enslavement to pay that off. Today's society is marked by various forms of crippling debt that leave people struggling to survive. Doesn't matter what kind of debt it is, from student loans to medical debts. Many individuals are caught in cycles that feel inescapable, that they've inherited. The staggering rise of student debt in the U.S. alone, the student debt is over $1.74 trillion, a 66% increase over the last decade. What has also changed in that decade? The cost of education has more than doubled in the last 40 years, and many borrowers find themselves unable to repay that kind of debt back, often having to delay other things in their life, like home ownership or starting a family. The weight of this burden echoes the ancient debt slavery, trapping people in cycles, limiting their future opportunities. Medical debt is another form of modern-day enslavement. A single health crisis can plunge a family into financial ruin, with bills that far exceed their ability to pay. A cycle where basic needs are sacrificed in an attempt to cover medical costs, much like the Israelites who were forced into servitude due to unpaid debts. Today's debtors face a life where the possibility of financial freedom seems like it'll never be possible. Americans owe at least $195 billion of medical debt. Should I give more examples? Debt is not the only form of modern enslavement. Low wages, skyrocketing housing costs, the ever-increasing price of everything. I think it's also worth thinking about our modern prison system, which in many ways is also modern slavery. Though slavery is technically abolished, the way that the prison system in the U.S. works is that it has continued such practices. It is a form of oppression that disproportionately affects people of color and those in poverty that can't get themselves out. The U.S. has the largest prison population in the world, numbers that are similar to the amount of people that were enslaved in 1850. Mass incarceration has exploded in recent decades, largely due to nonviolent crimes. And prisons, rather than serving as places of rehabilitation, are just warehouses for people to be. They are often forced into labor with little or no pay, a practice that strongly echoes what slavery is and was. And then, upon release, many face additional barriers: limited rights, difficulty finding employment, housing, separation from families. And so just as the ancient Jubilee sought to release people from the chains of slavery, of debt, we must break the chains today with mass incarceration and the modern day slavery that it represents. A society that would want to reclaim or live into God's dream would work to restore justice and dignity and opportunity to those who have been wrongfully or disproportionately oppressed, or those who have served their time and still oppressed. I believe the call to live out Jubilee is still a dream that is available to us. It's still a dream that is possible. We are invited to dream boldly of a world where everyone has what they need to thrive, where justice is restored and the chains are broken. Some examples of the ways that people have tried to live into Jubilee practices. Some congregations have stepped into the call. For example, congregations in North Carolina and congregations in Pennsylvania have set out to forgive up to $5 million of medical debt in their communities, partnering with organizations. Some have bought up medical debt, freeing over 3,300 families from crushing financial burdens. And some churches have ended up forgiving over $3 million, partnering with an organization called RIP Medical Debt, a nonprofit that uses donations to buy and erase bundled portfolios of debt. And then over the past few years, this organization has had over 800 congregations partnering with it, which has canceled the debts of many, not just in the congregation, but outside of it as well. Many of those church leaders have cited Leviticus as the reason why they have participated in such initiatives, that the call for action that is brought to us in Leviticus is still possible today, that there are practical things that we can do, not just in millions of people, but even in the life of one person, to eliminate some of the burden that they experience. And so this is Jubilee in action, releasing people from the weight of debt that would otherwise bind them for years. Jubilee calls us to imagine a different way, one where you're not punished for having a medical emergency, or you're not punished for pursuing an education, where these things don't result in a lifetime of change. Other examples is things that churches have done to address mass incarceration, where they've committed to programs and education and resources for people that are re-entering into society and reintegrating, helping them learn about what they've missed, helping them figure out how to apply for jobs, advocating for jobs to not ask for criminalization records if they don't need them, right? Like taking that off of job applications if it's not needed. Advocating for people to get paid when they do labor, right? Like, we don't want to continue slave practices. Creating a society where people are no longer punished for past mistakes after they've, done their time, after they've practiced accountability. A critical part of this would also be the expungement of records when we don't need them, especially for things that are nonviolent. And so what are ways that we can offer re-entry opportunities, remove barriers, ensuring that people who serve their time have dignity that is restored, that they're able to break free from cycles, that they're able to access jobs, able to access housing, so that they don't go back into the situation that they were in. Today we are called to be creative, to dream up our own dreams of how we can participate in Jubilee, creating pathways for those who have been marginalized to rebuild their lives. Living Jubilee, God's dream, means reimagining the world, not just as it is, but as it could be. A world where chains are broken and everyone can thrive. And so in reflecting on this ancient practice, we are reminded of the urgent need we have to think about how we use our resources in ways that address systems. Just as the Israelites were called to reset the systems that trapped people, we too are called to participate. To live out this vision, we have to go back to the beginning of the sermon, which is reclaim our ability to dream. Things aren't just the way they seem, but we let ourselves dream, whether that's through sleeping or whether that's through waking, But what could we put in place to make this vision come to life? Dreaming is not just an escape, it's a tool for creativity, for healing, for freedom. It allows us to envision new possibilities and reimagine our place in it. God's dream for us is still Jubilee, a world where debts are forgiven and all people are set free. So may we have the courage today to dream boldly and to act faithfully with the power that we do have, working together to make God's dream a reality. Amen. And so now is your opportunity to share some of the things bubbling up in you and thoughts that may be coming up.
I was really smiling when you were beginning with your story today, or your sermon today, because you were talking about something that I didn't ever see happening. And I was glad you finally came around and said that it probably didn't happen very many times back then, because I kept thinking, well, it's certainly not happened in my lifetime. I haven't seen it as a big picture happening in this country. But I think about putting it into a smaller perspective and not the overwhelming big picture that we see and see the status of our country today. I think about the small things that people do to help other people. And I think about when there's a fire in the neighborhood and neighbors come together to help that's a small replica of that, of thinking about it. And I thought about my grandkids. When my daughter died, she had debt, she had medical bills, she had 4 kids that she left, and friends and family came together and they sponsored a golf tournament for the kids for 6 or 7 years and raised money for the kids' education, and they all have gone to college. So I saw that happen. I've experienced it. I see it. I was thinking about your hairdresser today, and I'm thinking, well, here's their community and people that we know. Maybe we can help that grandmother that's going to have those 2 kids to raise, because I know what that feeling is of wondering how we're going to get through this. But there's lots of examples of how that is happening in our country today and in communities and places. So it's not all negative.
No, yeah, those are beautiful examples, for sure. Yeah, and then we may find that there are things that we can do for these stories that we hear. Certainly not everything and all of it we are called to, but we are called to figure out our role, our capacity. Yeah. Adrian. Let's get you the mic.
A couple of things hit me when it was interesting when you read about the Jubilee and how it was supposed to be done. The only remembrance I have of Jubilee is the fact that with some of I think they were mostly African countries, where they either got or were asking for a Jubilee year to not have to pay back the funds they got from, I think it was the International Monetary Fund. And it did happen in a couple of instances. But the thing that I think is interesting, it was the exact reverse of what the passage said, because these were, people who were loaned money by foreigners. And that was the Jubilee year. The other thing I was thinking of, and I probably took this way too far, but
that's okay.
the forgiveness of debt that is associated with medical debt, you've probably heard that the administration was putting forward that one's credit score should not include medical debt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something they've been trying to push. And I started thinking about that, and I said, oh, that's really good. Except what's going to happen is when medical people see that that's going on, I mean, a hospital might have to take you, but a doctor probably wouldn't, because they're going to see that, you haven't been paying medical debt. And if you follow it through, for those people that are always shouting socialism, it takes us pretty close to free medical care for all. Wouldn't that be wonderful? If you don't have to pay for medical debt. I mean, we can go on and talk about how it works in Canada, and everybody's not happy about it. But it would be a very interesting thing. So unfortunately, we have too many companies that their entire gross profit is based on keeping people in debt slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So how to get out of it? I like your idea, and I wish we had more money, because I would suggest that when we think about who we're going to give some of our money to, that we include that group that you talked about that helps pay off. I mean, I guess we're small. We just do it in our small way, but I think it would be a really good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of those congregations that I mentioned, I mean, they're huge, right? But there may be, small ways, or even just giving a contribution to those organizations to say, we see you and we value the work that you're doing. We don't have all of the people, but we see the work that you're trying to do. So it's something to think about and talk about. But a lot of what you said resonated with me, and a lot of these things, this passage in Leviticus, is pretty political. It's not partisan, but it's pretty political, right? And it is that kind of thing where it would ask us to say, where would this lead us? If we really did this, where would this lead us? And people get really scared, like you were saying. But what would it actually look like for people to be free from these things on a wide scale? And like student loans is something that has been talked about many, many times. Many people have had their loans forgiven in the last year or two, but it's being blocked now. So it's back in the courts, and how do we create pathways so that that doesn't keep happening? It would help all of us if we forgave student debt, right? So how do we keep that on the forefront of our minds? Yeah.
Just going back to what Adrienne was saying about where we donate, and the board talks about that, and lots of times we're looking towards things that are kind of related to crises, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've given to Gaza, organizations that support folks in Gaza, or different crises if there's, natural disasters, immigration, which, of course, we want to continue to do, but the things that you pointed out, which are also crises, but they're just like constant.
Yeah.
But those are really good things for us to think about too, because I think what you're saying, that's a different way. Sometimes I'm just saying that we have to sometimes reset this is the crisis of the week or the crisis of the month versus this insidious, lower constant level thing. And I also wanted to say, I loved, and I'm not going to say it exactly like you did, but the sentence that you said about us dreaming with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something about what stewardship is. We think of it as so many different things. Like with stewardship, people get nervous. But what if we thought about it as dreaming with God, with whatever we have? It's not just money, but it's our talents, our intelligence, our experience, all of that. So, yeah. Yeah, Taro.
Speaking of stewardship of the land, and I don't know if that was a practice that was followed at all, but think how much better we'd be off if we had let the land rest every 7 years,
Right.
or continued, and I think that was a practice of not harvesting all the way to the edges, because we saw in Ruth, the story of Ruth, and to plan on a certain percentage of whatever business you're in giving. I love the idea of the organization erasing medical debt. I get angry, and this is really bothering me, like, on the political nature of this, that there's so many people that consider themselves Christians and are doing the exact opposite of what it says in the scripture that they say they're following. And this is such a good example. I mean, how can you get around saying, take care of the poor and take care of, forgive the debts? And I mean, it's very specific. And when I was listening to you, I was also thinking, where is Jubilee in the New Testament? So I was so glad you brought that up, that Jesus saw that on, and I don't, based on his life, it wasn't just a philosophical, I am the Jubilee and the salvation. It was the real, he was there helping the widows and the poor and lifting them up and the children. And, so that just really bothers me. I'm like, I wish there was a way I could get people to see. And then I think about the story you shared last week about having a conversation. Maybe that's what I need to pray for, having like one-on-one conversations with somebody. Because I see these posts on Facebook and I want to respond, and then I think that's just gonna get ugly, and I don't want to get ugly. So the other thing I wanted to mention with the prison situation, my son's looking for a job, and he has commented on several jobs saying, I don't know what it said, if it was convict people with a prison record or whatever, please apply. So that there were business, and he thought that was weird, and I said, no, I think they're business owners who specifically want to help people reintegrate.
Yeah.
But I had not seen that advertised, as opposed to just not paying attention to it when people come, or not having it on their job applications.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a really neat way of, being inclusive and welcoming. I mean, if you're looking for a job and you're just get turned down, that would be a ray of light. So.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. I haven't, well, actually, I have seen that a couple times, because there's been so much research on this in the last decade, just the effects of mass incarceration and the difficulties that people have when they leave, and the recidivism rates of people because they don't have opportunities and they're denied from everything. So they're like, well, I know these people, I'm just going to go back to that, instead of people actually saying, no, we do want people, so that, and that's an important task. It doesn't work for every field, right? Like, you want to keep people safe and you want to be wise, but there are many, many jobs where that makes perfect sense, and is a way for people to build in structure and routine and to contribute to society in good ways. So, but yeah, I also think you're right that when people are quoting scriptures in the media and things, it's like hardly ever Leviticus 25. It's like, can we go back to Jubilee? Like, why is that not on a national stage of how we can live into the scriptures? Yeah, maybe we put the year of Jubilee in schools, or in government offices or something. I don't know. That's above what I get paid for. But yeah, like, what are ways that this could be at the forefront of our minds? And I love that for the churches who were able to do this sort of thing, the church leaders were quoting these scriptures, saying, no, I'm actually doing what the Bible encourages, and then what Jesus reminded us of as well as part of his ministry. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for this word, a very important word for us. And it's a great sermon on the Jubilee. And thanks for sharing, all the comments, and to hear the stories which I'm hearing as a resistance of communities to, what is happening, and the systems in the society that tell us no, we are individuals,
Yes.
and we we live for ourselves and we accumulate as much as we can. So the story of Jubilee I also see related to this sermon last week, which is one about God's economy
Yes.
linked with the Jubilee, and I'm really grateful for this congregation in terms of how you yourselves model that kind of resisting what we're hearing and seeing, in the community, and especially, I'm a visitor, as I said, I'm from Guyana, and it's very interesting times in the United States where everything is linked to some kind of ideology, but then it's so, I mean, a little bizarre sometimes,
Yeah.
when I hear, because I often wonder how would, in our public witness, how do we see Jesus, who asked Zacchaeus to return
Yes.
to people, what he took from them, and who said to Nicodemus,
Yes.
you want you want to be born again to find your way to God. Well, this is what you have to do. And so the stories of resistance, is very important. And thank you so much for raising that issue about the prison system and the
Yes.
modern slavery. We are not talking about it. Yes, it's overwhelming, but we ourselves, when we turn a blind eye, it's hard to hear, it's hard to know, but we are part of that system that upholds and maintains, this kind of atrocity against people. I myself in Guyana, as we know, society built, on slavery, massacre of indigenous people
Yeah.
when Columbus came, and the Caribbean had the second highest slaves from West Africa. I think the United States of America was the third, the first, of course, was Brazil, the largest number.
Right.
And then I myself, of East Indian descent from India, indentured laborers were brought to replace the slave labor after emancipation. So we are from these societies where, we were enslaved by that system, but guess what? We become part of that system because we are reading the Bible with the eyes of the masters, and we have, been clothed with it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I think this word is so important for, our eyes to be open, for each of us to know our place in public witness.
Yes.
To share the word of God, and I love, dreaming with God.
Yeah.
It's really lovely. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of what you said. It was so beautiful, and the context that we have of just having different countries represented as well, is so important for us, an important perspective to see also that it doesn't have to be this way. There are other countries that have found ways to undo some of these things, that have found ways to interrupt some of these things, and in many ways are looking at us like, really? Yeah, you can add more.
Because it's
Go
just
for
all
it.
over the place. Of course, the story about eat dogs and cats, and yeah, and I have my sisters, my daughter. They live here, so I'm hearing all of it. And yeah, there's a time you hear and it's joking. People are making all these, and I understand it because. But then there's a deeper issue that I
Yes.
think we need to address and be outraged about. It's about, how we are perpetuating hate and violence on people, and Haitians of all people, and I'm glad that John Legend, who is from Springfield, is it
Yes.
Yes, he spoke out, and others have spoke out about Springfield and what the immigrants did. But then we are hearing these stories about what's happening to the people, and they're fearing now.
Yes.
So I think there is a time, there's everything to laugh. I myself, found I'm getting a lot of entertainment, but then there is a serious issue about what, as a society, as a church, we need to be outraged about and express, this in our public witness.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, and that's something to, add to our prayers. I was guilty of that as well. I mean, there was a lot of funny things this past week. But then by midweek, I was reminded by those who I'm in community with that are called to hold us accountable and just say, pause for a minute. That hurts people. And the first thing we need to say is that is wrong, and people need to be protected, right, instead of that. And so, we have different ways of coping with the atrocity that we live in. And so sometimes laughter is a part of that, but it should not keep us from recognizing that people are actively being harmed right now because of it. And so the first, most important thing we need to say is this is wrong. And those students, and our Haitian siblings who have already just been through so much deserve to be protected. So, absolutely. Any other things coming up with Jubilee? Hopefully there will be more conversations about examples of things that have been done, because I think we're in a beautiful time where things are being done. The more that we learn about the prison system, the more that we learn about how much debt really has been accumulated, there have been different initiatives. And so maybe this is a continued conversation about what's being done and what kind of dreams are being created and enacted. So, all right.